I will share my screen. And here we go. All right. Just fill up the screen.
Is Catherine Kehoe with us?
Yes,
Oh, she is. Okay. Because hers bounced back, but I just sent it to her again.
thank you. Okay, here we are. So as I was saying at the beginning, some of you hadn't signed on yet, is that media ethics, journalistic ethics is usually a course that is taught throughout the length of a semester. It's not something we do in an hour and a half. Okay. And I've taught this course before. And so what I've done here, like at a Catholic university here in Indiana. And so I've taken this semester long course and I've taken the highlights of the course and I've shrunk it down to about an hour. We're going to take about a half hour to do like an exercise. Okay. The challenge here that we have is we already lost 15 minutes. So I'm going to get right into it. Okay. All right. Um, And so I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until the end, okay? Or right before the exercise so that we can move through the content as much as possible. All right? Okay. So that media, journalism, it happens in an interdisciplinary context, right? And so when we practice ethics, we're practicing ethics within a particular context and a particular social reality. We're not independent of that. We don't operate in a vacuum. We're like within this media sphere. And so we need to understand what the landscape is, right? And the general landscape, what we can say is that we've entered into a period of what would be considered a period of media illiteracy, despite the fact that there's a lot of media consumption. When it comes to news media, there's a certain amount of illiteracy. Well, there's been changes in the way we consume the news. There are changes in the ways we produce the news, of course, but in the ways that we interpret the news, right? There's this information overload that we all experience every day. All of us do, right? And so it's very difficult for people to identify what is the information that I really need to know, right? And then what is its usefulness to me in my life? And the way that you may have noticed this as well, the news media, journalists, editors are trying to cope with this new reality. Reuters does this, The Guardian does this, um, Axios does this, right? They developed this system called smart brevity, and you can actually, there's a TEDx talk about this as well, is you'll see a news headline and then there'll be bullet points. Like, here are the three main things you need to know about the story. And then there's even a little paragraph that says, why is this important? Right? People aren't able necessarily to make the connection between the information and why it's important for them to know about this information. And so, as journalists, a lot of news outlets are doing that, right? They're repackaging the news so that people understand why the story is important to them and in their lives. This is one of the ways that we're trying to cope with this media illiteracy, right? Or this news illiteracy. We used to, I don't know about you, but when I grew up, uh, we grew up watching television news together with our parents. So it's a learned behavior, right? Understanding news and understanding how it applies to you is a learned behavior. We learn about it within our families. Generally, there was a time where families would sit around the radio together and listen to the news together, right? It was an interpretive, common activity. We don't do that anymore. A lot of our families, they each have their own phone, they each have their own device, and there isn't that kind of natural learning. Okay, so we try to compensate for that in the news media itself. There's also the sociological function of media. We are operating within this sociological function. There's something called the sociology of media. It's an actual discipline, right? And so we have Marshall McLuhan, who's actually a cultural studies scholar. He taught English as well at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. He was a convert from Anglicanism, um, who reflected on the media and the way the media affects society and the way the media affects culture, right? And how it changes culture and that one impacts the other. right? It's not just media changing culture, it's culture changing media. There's this relationship, right? This give and take, and that can sometimes be conflicting and sometimes be very upsetting for certain aspects of our lives, of our families' lives, etc. Right? And then there's another sociologist called Nicholas Luhmann, who talks about the media as contributing to the meaning-making system of society. So media isn't just about, it's not just a platform, it's not just a tool that we use to convey information or to entertain people. No, right? Media is part of the system that we have in society that helps us generate meaning. We generate meaning as a society, as a group. We also generate meaning for ourselves. All right. So this is why it's within this context we understand the power of media is not just the information that it conveys, right? But the way that it interacts in the meaning-making system of society. He talks about society as a system with subsystems that interact with each other. It's a little more complex than what I can explain now here, but something to read about and to understand. Okay, and because it has this impact on society, this is where it becomes super important for us to act ethically. We're not just acting ethically because we want to be good, because it's the right thing to do, but because it has real repercussions on our society. And this is why it's really important that we understand our ethics, how to act ethically in society. Okay, so what is the responsibility of the media? Okay, I just already said this, right? Since the media contribute to meaning making in society and therefore social values, then journalists must act accordingly, right? To sound ethics. Okay, so what are ethics? Ethics is a code of professional standards of behavior and decision making based on predetermined principles exercised toward a specific aim or ideal. They're not relativistic, right? They're not kind of coming up on the spur of the moment. They're predetermined. We've reflected on them, and we have decided that these are the most important principles to follow for us to have ethical communication, right? They're objective. They're outside of ourself. We can point to them as like a third party outside of ourselves, right? They're rational. We can refer to them. They're empirical, right? And this is where their strength resides, right? In the fact that it's not about me and what I think or my feelings on a particular day, right? It has nothing to do with my feelings. If I'm faced with an ethical dilemma, I look at my ethical standards that are outside of myself and I use those to make a decision about how to act, right? At the same time, if you make a decision in your article or in your newspaper as an editor and someone will question your decision, you there again, it's very handy to have this list of ethics, right? These so that you can point to them and say, well, Mr. So-and-so, dear reader, this decision was made based on these principles. You can point to something outside of yourself that you can refer to. So someone may disagree with your decision, someone may perhaps disagree with your ethical framework, but at least you have something that's outside of you, objective, that you can point to explain your decision. It's not because, oh, well, I felt or I thought and all this kind of personal. We ourselves are not our point of reference for this. It's something outside of us, okay? And that's what the third point is about, right? It's a decision that stands on its own merit, rooted in a tried and tested framework, right? That's objective. So we have 5 principles of journalistic ethics. Truth and accuracy is one of them, all right? We want to get the facts right. We want to give all the relevant facts for within a story, within the proper context, right? So you need to also be able to indicate in your article if you weren't able to verify something. If you put something in your story that you couldn't verify in terms of a fact, then you would need to indicate that, right? Or just not include it at all in your article. We want to respect independence. What does this mean? That we need to disclose any conflicts of interest. So for instance, when I report on something that's happening, or I did do this, right? Report on something that's happening in my parish and I submit it to an outlet, I need to indicate in the author bio that I'm a parishioner of this parish that I reported on. I need to disclose my conflict of interest. And it could be a personal relationship that I have with an institution. It could be a political affiliation or other such affiliation. Another principle is fairness and impartiality. All right. So we want to present both or all sides of, of a particular issue. Now, some issues have multiple sides, right? You can look at something from multiple perspectives. Well, if you're writing a news story, for instance, we talked about how news stories are generally rather short, right? 700 to 800 words. And so you can't include every perspective in that many words, right? So you may want to publish another article presenting more perspectives on a particular issue. But you need to be able to present editorially your information with balance, right? Whether it's within one article or within a series of articles. And in some instances, if you're writing a newspaper, print publication, even if it's an online publication, you may want to indicate if you're going to be doing this, restricting your articles to presenting only one or two points of view, that you're going to be presenting other articles with other points of view to let the reader know that you're going to be dealing with this in an ethical way, in a balanced way, and they can look out for that, okay? Giving different voices their proper space, right? Not moralizing or editorializing. Humanity, this idea of respecting the dignity of the human person, which we're going to talk about more a little later, but doing no harm in the process of our work, right? That is in the gathering of information and also in the writing and publishing of information. Okay, it's not just in the final output that we do no harm, it's also in the gathering, okay, of the information. And the last one is accountability. So if there is a mistake that's been made in your article, whether it's in the gathering process of the information or in the publishing, the writing process, the lack of fact checking, etc., we need to admit to that, right? If we make a correction to our website, you'll see this a lot on news websites. If the article was updated, right, it'll indicate at the bottom, this article was updated, right? This fact was corrected, or this is a corrected version of an article that was previously published, right? It'll indicate that this article was revised in some way, or what I prefer is that you actually point out the mistake that was made and correct it, not just that it was updated, right? But what was the mistake? What was the mistake that was made? And what is the actual correction? We used to run that in print in the newspaper that I used to work for, the first paper that I worked for, and even in the paper that I edited previously, diocesan paper, we had a section called mea culpa. So if there was a factual error, right, we indicated in this particular article published on this date, this was incorrect. This is the corrected fact, right? Um, we want to be able to listen to audience concerns and respond to their concerns. If they, not to silly concerns, I mean, sometimes you get all kinds of weird letters to the editor, but you want to acknowledge and validate your readers' concerns and address them and take the time to explain them and to explain your thought process. And in some instances, it's very important to do that, right? And to offer any reasonable remedies for harm done. Sometimes it's just a matter of running a mea culpa. Another instances, you may want to rerun a whole new article with a different perspective. It depends. It depends on the situation, okay? But accountability. Now, approaches to ethics. This is where I was talking about having an objective framework, something outside yourself, okay? So here we have 4 different frameworks that we can use within which we can operate in our exercise of ethics and our practice of ethics. Okay, these are the more popular ones, and I'll go through some of them rather quickly, and we'll kind of settle in on the last one that's there, the theistic approach, which is the biblically or religiously inspired approach, which is our approach as Catholic journalists, right? This would be our ethical framework, but it's important to understand the other ethical frameworks because they do crop up even in a Catholic environment. And in some cases, they're valid means by which to make a decision, right? In terms of what to publish or how to publish it or how to present certain information, how to go about something. And it's also good to know what these are so that you can engage in conversations with others who are using these frameworks, right? So that we're not ignorant to these types of frameworks. The important thing here is that none of these frameworks are feelings based, right? They're all reasoned approaches to the exercise of ethics. Okay, so let's look at virtue ethics. This is Aristotle, and he used this idea of like the golden mean, right? The virtue ethics. So the golden mean holds that virtue is somewhere between two extremes, right? Trying to find a balance between telling the truth and minimizing harm by understanding the consequences of our actions. And it's based on this kind of respect and fair treatment of all, right? It's treatment of others as you would want to be treated. The Immanuel Kant had, this is the deontological approach, right? Had something that he came up with called the categorical imperative. I know I'm going through this very quickly, but you're going to get the PDF for you. You could read through this, okay? On your own time later. As I told you, I'm just trying to squeeze it in because we lost time at the beginning. Okay. And his categorical imperative is this, right? Act only on a principle, or what he called the maxim, okay? Act only on a maxim that you can at the same time will to become universal law. So the translation of this is, if you wouldn't want your particular action or principle to become universally acceptable, right, as a principle or a behavior, then you don't want to do it. Okay. So would it be okay, is the question you would ask yourself, if everyone did what I'm about to do, right? And what would happen if they did do what I'm about to do? So you want to take a particular action and then extend it into the future and ask yourself, well, if everybody, uh, lied, it's just a little white lie, but if everybody said white lies, well, what would happen to our society, right? And so then, of course, it would be, the logical conclusion would be, well, we wouldn't be able to trust anybody anymore. We wouldn't know what would be true anymore. We couldn't really operate as a society anymore, right? If you take it all the way, stretch it all the way down, right, and actually apply a kind of universalist principle here. Well, then that tells you, well, then I shouldn't tell a white lie now either, because I wouldn't want that everybody do this, right? And so you can take this from the smallest or the most venial sin, to use Catholic terms, right, to the most serious or grave situation, you know? Um, um, should I be sarcastic in this situation? Well, would I want that everyone be sarcastic? And it also kind of, and when you kind of universalize it, when you extrapolate to that degree, it'll sometimes stop you in your track and say, I should think twice about that, right? So his point of view was there's a duty, right? It's based on the duty to what? A duty to goodness. We have the duty to be good, right? And that morality is fulfilling this duty. And so laws are necessary for order. Everybody is equal. There's not one person who should be allowed to act in a particular way over someone else based on where they are in society, what their roles are, et cetera, et cetera. There are no excuses for that kind of thing, right? Um, no one should be treated as a means to an end, right? Because we wouldn't want that all people be treated as a means to an end, because again, the logical extrapolation of that down the road would be catastrophic, right? Um, so the end doesn't justify the means, and it's not about your feelings, right? And so the same thing here would apply. For instance, I may want to tell Paul a white lie because I don't want to hurt his feelings, right? So my feelings don't count, but also his feelings don't count, because I'm called by my duty to tell the truth. Duty requires me to tell the truth. Okay. Now you can tell the truth, different ways of telling the truth, but you understand my point, right? And so it's based on reason. Now the consequentialist approach, the most popular one, is utilitarianism. So John Stuart Mill, right, is a very famous philosopher within this particular philosophy, right? So here, the idea is the best action to take is the one that creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Or the greatest benefit or good for everyone affected, even if the action is questionable. So in this scenario, the ends do justify the means, right? And so, I don't know if you'd had this experience when you were in high school or in college, you kind of do like a little bit of amateur philosophy, and we say, was it the right thing for the Americans to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima or not, you know? Well, when we look at it, a utilitarian would say, yes, yes, it was justified because it ended the war and people died in the process, but that's okay, right? A Kantian approach would say, no, absolutely not, right? Because the means were destructive and that doesn't justify the ends. So you can see how these two frameworks, how you would argue one thing very differently. But it's important to understand the framework, right? To see where these people coming from, and whichever framework you choose, then you're able to defend it, and you can at least reason it and explain it. You may not agree with it, but at least you can explain it, right? And so for Mill, morality depends on balancing the beneficial and the harmful consequences of behavior, right? But it is always determined by that which will benefit the most people. So in that case, it might be the right thing to tell Paul a white lie, right? Or to say a white lie in this instance or another, so as not to hurt the people's feelings, so as not to upset some sort of a harmony or peace within a particular group, right? So as not to create a ruckus. We can justify these things using this particular framework. Okay. The problem with Mill, um, with utilitarianism, which was at the origins of utilitarianism, was Jeremy Bentham, right? He talked about that that the ultimate good was really pleasure, right? Pleasure was good, is the ultimate good. From a Christian point of view, we don't agree with this, right? But I'm telling you this because it's super important when we're going to talk about how we organize our media. Okay, so this principle here is important. The ultimate good for Jeremy Bentham, who was who's pre-Mill, okay, is the search for pleasure. An extreme search for pleasure is hedonism. What Mill said was, yes, pleasure is super important. We want pleasure. Pleasure is good, right? We want to pursue pleasure, right? But there are different kinds of pleasures. There's the higher pleasures and there's the lower pleasures, right? And here, this is where he applied a moral judgment on the pleasures, right? And the idea that we can actually educate our feelings and our pleasures, that not all pleasures are equal, that they're lower or base pleasures, right? The kind of the more vulgar. So how does this apply to the media? Well, what we see developed are two different approaches to media models, okay? And the one that's informed by utilitarianism is this thing called the market-led media model, where essentially we're giving people what they want, right? We are catering to what makes them feel good, what they enjoy, right, to their pleasures. That's the market-led media model. We're adopting this utilitarian model and we're applying it over top of how we do media and what kind of media we publish and broadcast, etc. Right? And so we don't really judge the content, right? We don't really judge the contents. Like anything goes, right? They want gore, we give them gore. They want sex, we give them sex. They want whatever CSI, whatever, just give them whatever they want, right? It sells, whatever sells. People are tuning in to whatever sells. So we're just going to keep giving them more and more and more of that, right? This whole idea, again, if it bleeds, it leads, right? When in terms of the news sometimes. And this market-led media model is geared toward profit, right? And we shut down this media. This market-led media approach says if it's not making money, we shut it down. If there's no profit, we shut it down. Okay. The problem is that it's operating from this rational spectator fallacy. This is like a sociological analysis of this model, that the fallacy is that consumers know what they like and how to choose what they want. What this fails to take into account is that most people are enticed or manipulated by what is easy, what appeals to their emotions. So they think they know what they want. what they're really going for is like the lowest common denominator because it's easy. I mean, if there's one word that sells in advertising more than any other word, well, there are two: easy and simple. Anything that points to easy, give it to me, easy. Just kind of pablum, right? This whole idea of like, um, um, yeah, the most for the least, right? Um, and Marshall McLuhan, going back to him who I mentioned at the beginning, he has this expression called the medium is the massage. This whole idea that what comes out of comes out in this particular market-led model is is a manipulation, right? It's a softening of the mind, it's a softening of the spirit, it's a softening of the person, right? And we're manipulated by it. So um, the market-led model is problematic in this way, right? The opposite approach is the public broadcasting model, and which provides, like it says here, a counterweight, right? Which is looking at more educational content. It's not the if it bleeds, it leads. It's not emotionally engaging. It may not get all the clicks online or the viewers on, during prime time, but it's educational, right? It educates the intellect. And so this is where Mill made the distinction between lower pleasures and higher pleasures, right? And so the public broadcasting model is trying to appeal to the higher pleasures. So we look at what's on PBS, right? You have the ballets, you have the opera, you have the news programs, you have the educational children's programs, right? And this idea of trying to like preserve the arts and protect the arts, right? And so in this model, the media is understood to want to support the development of people, or the development of society, right? Toward this particular ideal, right? The higher ideal, the more intellectual ideal. Now, it's very interesting because, when I would teach this class at the college level, the students would inevitably say, well, that's kind of snooty and elitist, you know, and that's passing judgment on what is preferred. What's to say the opera is high culture or high pleasure? What's to say that we all have to like the ballet or this kind of thing? So there's this criticism against the public broadcasting model, which is valid, right? But it's this idea that we're trying to engage the mind of the person, the whole person, and not appeal to their lower senses, right? So So then where does the church media model fit in to all of this, right? And this is the question that as Catholic journalists and editors, we need to ask ourselves. Okay, so there's the market-led media model, we know that very well. There's the public broadcasting model, the BBCs of the world, the CBCs of the world. We can criticize these organizations for their biases. They all have them, okay? But we have these models. We know these two models. Well, where do we fall as church media, right? Are we doing market-led, or are we doing public broadcasting model? And what we're suggesting here is that it's a both and, right? So we have these lower pleasures that we're trying to appeal to our readers. We're using these lower pleasure kind of stories to appeal to attract the readers, right? To have them opening the newspaper. So human interest stories, local events, things like the recipes or the sports pages from our local Catholic high school, and these kinds of more kind of everyday things. But we're also appealing to the higher pleasures, aren't we? When we write stories about the synod, about encyclicals, about catechesis, about theological reflection, about the church teachings. This is the higher, heftier stuff that's we really got to chew, right? And we do this because we believe as Christians, and this is not what, any you'll find in the secular media, that there's really a higher pleasure even beyond the intellect, right? That for Catholics and for Christians and for Catholic media, we're interested ultimately in the highest pleasure, which in the East we call theosis, right? This union with God. So we're printing all of these stories, but for what purpose? It's not just to appeal to people's sense of community and make them feel comfortable and appeal to their emotions and make them feel um, included within a faith community or right. And we're not just appealing to their intellect with all this theological discourse, right? We want to use this to point them to something even beyond this world, aren't we? We're reporting on this world, pointing them to something beyond, right? And so this is what distinguishes us as church media, that we're not just stopping within the world here, at the human person. We're pointing to something beyond the human person. And so we do this then within this theistic ethical framework, right? Which is based in the teachings of our faith and the morality that comes from scripture, right? And elaborated in church teaching through Catholic social teaching, right? Through encyclicals, through other types of elaborations on how we understand our ethical moral framework, right? Or what we're being called to live, how we're being called to live morally and ethically in this world. Um, so at the very basis, at the foundation of all of this, sorry, I'm looking at the time here, is an understanding that people are made in the image and likeness of God, right? And therefore imbued with this inherent sense of dignity, right? And so we, as Catholic journalists, are called to take the utmost care in the news production process and the journalism production process that we went through last week, all those multiple steps, right? That respects this inherent dignity. And of course, we have texts outside of ourselves that we can point to, that we can use, we can refer to in making these decisions, right? Commandments, Proverbs, the Golden Rule, and every other writing that we have related to our morality. So we see some of these articulated, captured in the Fair Publishing Practices Code of the Catholic Media Association, right? And so if you haven't had a chance to read them yet, you can read them on your own. I sent an email with the PDF attached. Someone had written and said, can't access it, and that's because, so sorry, it was hidden behind the members. It's like in the member section of the CMA website. The most updated one of 2019, okay, is in the member section. And I'm sorry, I access it so easily because I'm a member, and some of you who aren't members couldn't have access to that. So that was my oversight. I apologize, but you now have it all. All of you have it, okay? So this idea of truth, right? And this idea here, we'll go down to the bottom here, right? The guiding principle, any breach of truth, which we talked about in our first class with Paul and Peter, is hurtful, right? To ourselves and to other people. And so here we see here on articulated differently, right? The 5 principles of journalistic ethics that I talked about at the beginning of this session, right? Truth and accuracy, independence, accountability, right? You'll see those here, right? Articulated here, which if you haven't read yet, you can read, and you'll be able to read this presentation as well. I will send it to you like I did last week, okay? And this applies not only to print, but also to photography, right? In videography, podcasting, radio, our social media. These principles apply across the board, right? And here again, something interesting, right? That we distinguish in our publications between news and opinion, right? That we label advertising text or paid content so people can distinguish between the news and the paid content, right? And then of course some basic things that we should know already in any case, but we'll repeat it anyway. obviously never plagiarizing or disseminating confidential information. And we'll talk more about that, especially when we do the interviewing section. Okay, what's confidential? When is it fair to maintain things as off the record when, right? All that whole issue, which is an important issue. Okay, I'm going to skip this because we're out of time. I wanted to share with you some ethical mistakes that I made in my rookie years. And if we have time later, I can share that with you. Okay. One of the ethical issues that we run into a lot is this whole idea of privacy. And it's worth discussing before we go into our exercise. So, what's the difference between privacy and public interest? Okay. Our bishops, our cardinals, our priests are public figures, right? They serve the community. And we can say that the higher up the ladder you go, the more public you are, right? A bishop more so than a priest, and etc. And so, as public figures, including celebrities, political leaders, they abrogate a certain right to privacy by being a public figure. Okay, so every citizen's right to privacy, we can say, can be set aside for the sake of public interest or for public safety, right? To prevent harm to others. That's on the one hand, right? We can reason it this way, and it's understandable, right? So if there's a breach of ethics at the higher levels of government, of church, of other institutions, right? We want to report that. On the other hand, right, there are also limitations that we need to exercise to respect the dignity of the human person, right? So, for the sake of a person's dignity, some issues need not be exposed to the media. And that's sometimes a very, very fine line to walk, right? We see this in the political debates, right? Sometimes one candidate will infringe the privacy of another candidate as a kind of diversion tactic, right? Or to harm the campaign, right? And sometimes privacy, the person's dignity, can take priority over the public's right to know. Okay. From my ethical perspective, putting the whole theistic approach, theistic framework into practice, I would say the questions of safety are really pertinent here. Remember, I talked to you about what makes news, right? And proximity and oddity and prominence and all of these things, right? Are elements that we use to determine whether something is newsworthy. But there's also the questions of safety, right? Am I safe? Is my family safe? My community safe, etc. Right? And so questions of safety are pertinent here. And so this is when, if there are certain types of indiscretions that are committed by people, especially if they're criminal, right, that it's our duty to report these things, right? And so then we have to distinguish, then what is it that people will commit, acts that they will carry out on are things that we should report on, and what are things that we need not report on, right? And the question to ponder here is, should anything be published just because we can publish it? I mean, just because we can publish on a website, should we publish everything or anything? And that's something I'd be happy to talk about with people, because perhaps I'm talking a little bit around certain points here. Certainly, I think when it comes to issues of sexual abuse, we have to report these things without a doubt. But there are some things that some people will participate in that if we report on it, then we're participating in gossip. And it's a tabloid. So we have to walk that line and make that judgment. When it comes to privacy, Kant had something to say that I thought was interesting, right? If we're intruding on a person's privacy, then we are walking into an ethical dilemma, right? If we're intruding in their privacy, right? So we have to treat people with respect. And I think the idea here is to avoid humiliating people. So how can we report on something without humiliating the person, even though the act itself may be humiliating? How can we not add to that humiliation, right? The intention cannot be to humiliate. And the intention cannot be to treat the person as a form of entertainment, right? Or sensationalism. I mean, you see this when you stand at the pharmacy there and you have all these like gossip tabloid things. The intention behind that is to humiliate people, to add to the humiliation, to sensationalize, to treat them as entertainment, to objectify them, right? The intentions behind it, you can read through that, can't you? In the headlines and in the stories and in the photos that are selected. And in the way that we report on things, this for me is, I guess, is the most important thing. We can't take away from a person's opportunity to defend themselves, right? So reporting on an alleged crime where a person has the opportunity for due process, totally fair, right? Reporting on a situation where a person does not have the opportunity for public defense, in my opinion, is not fair because you're a public platform, right? So you have to give that person an opportunity to defend themselves. If you're not giving them that opportunity, then it crosses the line into the unethical. And there's never a tabloid paper that gives an opportunity for the celebrity that they're writing about to defend themselves, right? It's very unilateral. It's a one-way presentation of the information. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that, especially in the discussion period. But what I'd like to do now is to break us up into groups so we can work through some scenarios, okay? And you can discuss within your groups how you would deal with these scenarios as journalists and as editors, okay? How would you treat this content? And how would you, in terms of like gathering the information, and how would you then report on this content? The instructors have these scenarios. So when you break out into your groups, right, you won't see my PowerPoint presentation, but they have these scenarios, which I think you can share on your screens in your breakout groups. I'm not sure, but certainly they can read, okay? And this is an example of the first one, right? Reporting on vulnerable groups. We often, as Catholic journalists, report on vulnerable groups because we serve them, right? In our charitable works, we're constantly working and serving those who are vulnerable. And so how do we present them in our media? Abuse victims, the poor, recovering addicts, former prisoners, people who are disabled, who are ill, et cetera, right? How do we interview them, and then how do we present them? So if you'll give me a moment, I know I'm going so fast, but I'm going to create breakout rooms. Is that okay? So now let me see. We need 1, 2, 3 breakout rooms. Assign manually. Okay. Breakout room number 1. I'm just going 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. There's one group. Now do 2. And now we'll do 3. And we'll give ourselves, I hope I land into in one of these rooms. I'm trying to get into room 3. All right, that's with Clement and Gia. So hopefully I will I'll be able to join you. I've never done this before as both an instructor and an operator of the Zoom.
I didn't see any any rooms pop up. Did anybody else?
Not yet. I haven't hit the master
Oh,
button. I
got
haven't
it.
hit like the red button. Okay, so I'll do
Okay,
that.
hold
And
on.
yeah, and we'll give ourselves 20 minutes, okay, to go through 3 scenarios. All right, and then we'll come back and we'll debrief. And I hope, my gosh, I hope this works. All right, see you in 20 minutes.
Nice.
Did that work?
We've been bounced. Okay.
Apologies to my group. We got stranded
Stranded.
in the middle of starting our third question.
Ah, okay. Well,
We weren't done either.
let's go. Our group didn't even get to the third question. We have so many fantastic insights that and experiences
Yeah.
shared that we didn't even get there. So, well, how about we report back on our groups? Paul, why don't you start with your group?
I heard they had to teach. They taught. They got all the answers right at the beginning. The various options that are available. They got the point that you really don't want to go out there with the soup kitchen people, the disadvantaged, the vulnerable people, and take advantage of them, put them up there on display so you can get this award-winning story that maybe is using them. You can shoot around people so that you don't identify them. You can withhold names. I said get names so that when you go back to talk to your editor, you can explain the situation. Let's not use the name. Let's not identify who they are. We have good stuff here. And if they want to be identified, well, I'd say I'd want to take extra precautions to make sure they fully appreciate that what this could do to them if we identify them. And even then, you might not want to identify them. You've got children involved, vulnerable people.
Peter, your group?
There was a fairly quick consensus that the reporting would be done, but there would be those kind of precautionary steps taken to fudge names or cloud up names a bit. Maybe you just kind of soften up use some soft lens stuff on what the location is or the person's identity in order to protect them. And one of the points I think was made was the importance of being sure that the person is actually giving you permission to use whatever it is that they were saying. We took it a bit further because I made the point that you actually don't need their permission. But what you do need to do from an ethical perspective is to make sure that they understand what the consequences of this can be, especially for people who are in vulnerable situations, because people will see all kinds of incentives that 99.9% of the time don't actually exist. They imagine that there's some public good that they're doing. They imagine that maybe they'll get a little bit higher up in the pecking order at the soup kitchen or whatever their motivation might be. But the need is to make sure that they understand, look, this is going to be public. And you need to understand there may be consequences for that. And to go even beyond that and perhaps check back with them, post interview, call them, email, whatever, and say, you said this to me. Are you sure you're okay if I use that? Is your uncle the kind of guy that's going to take retribution on you? You have an obligation to actually make sure, not just that they say, yeah, it's okay, you can use it, but that they in depth understand that this has potential consequences. In terms of the withdrawal of the story from from the database because it might cause harm for past actions and future employment or whatever, and very eagerly said, "I'd write another story." It's a great story. I want to interview him again, which I think is the absolute perfect response, because we agreed. You can't lie by pretending that something that happened didn't happen, and you can't rewrite history. But what you can do is help him to understand, whoever the person might be, to understand that there are ways that you can actually turn this to the good. You can actually, as a priest entering, looking to enter seminary, a future priest, you can actually use this to understand how conversion works more deeply. So the process can be put to an advantage that way, but taking the story out, short of somebody being killed, was for our group anyway, a non-starter.
Mhm.
Did I cover that, guys? Was that, yeah, pretty, anything else that I left out or?
I would only add something about the first story that I didn't mention even in my group is that the publication that I work for, I mean, 80% of what we cover is vulnerable groups. And so what, as an editor, the instructions I try to give to the journalists is this, you're going to be covering beneficiaries of humanitarian aid, charitable aid from on the part of the church. Uh, I want you to include in your description of them an aspect of their agency. Don't just have like these kind of like lame ducks, kind of we're receivers, we do nothing, which is kind of a talking down to. But try to figure out what are they doing? What initiatives are they taking to care for their own families? What have they done that may be innovative to deal with their situation? What are their hopes for the future? What were they doing until they got to this point? Right? Because sometimes we don't necessarily cast the vulnerable people as people who had agency before this catastrophic thing happened to them, or that they're not even acting within their own agency within them in the midst of the war or in the midst of whatever catastrophe is being, right? We have this picture of them as being just waiting around for a handout, and that isn't the case. And so by focusing on or trying to look at their agency in this, kind of reveal that within this very dramatic, difficult situation, we are then restoring in them their dignity. And this is something that's really important too in terms of photography. The temptation sometimes, we see it all the time, is the poor child with the distended belly or the messy face or whatever, the disheveled hair. It's like, give money to the needy child. Uh, Again, this is a caricature, right? This is a characterization, whereas we're manipulating this particular child, we're manipulating the poor to benefit our organization. Of course, we say yes, but in order to give to them, yes, but how can we uh, present these vulnerable groups, regardless of who they are, street kids, recovering alcoholics, former prisoners, whatever, whoever the group is, in a light where their dignity remains intact, and we're not exploiting their weakness for the sake of the organization. Um, was there anything else that came out of that discussion
That came
about?
up in ours
Yeah,
too, Laura, the same point. And
yeah,
I said it's important as we're a Catholic newspaper. Let's show how grace might be working in their life as well. Because the secular paper can go out there and do this story of pathos and and tragedy, but we can show how redemption might be happening as well, if
yeah,
that's possible.
yeah.
The other thing too that I made a point, and I think it's worth it really is worth sharing, is that um, when we speak of vulnerable people, not all vulnerable people work in soup kitchens.
That's right.
Rich people are human too. Um, Often powerful people are very, very human and very, very fallible, as we well know. That doesn't mean it's, in fact, it means the opposite, it doesn't mean that that they are above, you know, being reported on. But at the same time, if they have vulnerabilities, we have to be aware of them. And the techniques and whatnot that we use as journalists to get people to talk, you have to be as circumspect. um, I mean, there's a special duty, obviously, to someone in a soup kitchen, but rich people can be stupid too. They can be loquacious, they can say things more than they should. And you need to be careful around that kind of thing. Well, she's a rich whatever with two Mercedes parked in the driveway. Yeah, but she's got a heart. She's got a family. Is this gonna serve a good to report it? So,
Yeah, in a moment of weakness, she may have unveiled something that she never told anybody.
yeah. But
Gotta go
I use the example of, I was interviewing this guy who was a big mocker, really, really uber rich guy who he started confessing to me about how his infidelity had ruined his marriage, but brought him back to his faith. And I'm going, they don't want to talk about your infidelity because you have no idea how that's going to read when it goes on the page, but your wife will. So anyway, you get the point.
Yeah, we talked about that in our group too. Gia was mentioning how people will tell her things, and it is amazing when people will confide in you, right, as a journalist, and it's like, whoa. And how you need to treat that tenderly, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel make them feel very comfortable, or as Laurie, you were saying, they feel the need to share. But yeah, sometimes I feel like saying, you don't need to tell me all of this. And I don't use, there's times I've been told things I don't use it because it's not necessary for the story, and I wouldn't. We talked some in our breakout about the line between, there's this choice. What do people need to know, and at what point are you becoming exploiting or sensationalizing a story? And so, yeah, I try to focus on what people need to know
Yeah,
as a
remember
guideline.
these are often usually people who don't have any media experience. They don't know how to deal with order. They're just opening up. It might be different if it's somebody who contacts you. A politician contacts you, says, I want to tell my entire story of conversion. I want to get into the dirt. I want to tell you what I've done. Okay, that's a different situation. You can talk about that
Yeah.
and how you're going to approach that and tell that story. But in that case, that person's aware of what they're doing.
Mhm.
These
The media
cases,
savvy.
yeah, yeah.
But it is kind of weird how sometimes people in the context of an interview will like use it as almost a confessional, like what we were all sharing, right, about the infidelity. And it's kind of bizarre sometimes, the situation you find yourself in, people telling you things, But yeah, very interesting. I'm really edified by everybody's conversation. The third scenario, two groups didn't get to it, so I'm just going to read it, and then Peter, you can tell us, how you guys dealt with it in your group. The bishop has decided to close 7 parishes and to sell the churches. Word is the parishes have less than average mass attendance, and funds are needed to pay some sex abuse settlements. You are assigned to write the story. Parishioners are upset about their church closures and use colorful language to tell you what they think of the bishop and his decision and the context of the church sales. The bishop does not want to be interviewed, and the bishop's office refuses to share with you the amount expected from the sale of the churches. First, how do you treat the parishioners' colorful comments? And second, you posed as a potential buyer for the properties and obtained the listed price. Do you print the sales prices and inform readers how much the settlement will be covered by the sale, as well as any shortfall the diocese would have to absorb?
Well,
You're going undercover.
We didn't get to that one either, but I can tell you that we just had a very similar scenario at the Catholic Register. We found out about this church in Newfoundland that it's been put up for sale as part of the proceeds for a settlement in a massive scandalous sexual abuse, basically, or a religious ordered sexual abuse case. And the locals in this parish in Newfoundland have changed the locks on the church and put up signs in the windows saying "not for sale." And a big sign on the front of the church, no real estate agents, no blah, 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 welcome here. And we put it on the front page with "not for sale" because it's a great story. I mean, the local, and there were some colorful, there was no foul language or anything, but there was some pretty colorful comments. And there's been a running battle going on with the Bishop Hunt and the parishioners. Well, you know what? It's a news story. I mean, it's a matter of public interest, and I don't know, like the idea of, I mean, being the Sherlock Holmes Society, going around with your magnifying glass, pretending, because I don't think you really need to. You can just go on MLS and find out what the list price is, or just talk to somebody quietly. I don't think you need to be, put on a fake hat and a beard and, like there's a lot of skullduggery that goes on. It's more duggery than skull. Like, you don't really need to do that. You just find out. And there's no, it should be a matter of public record anyway, right? So if you're asking, like, that's how not we would handle it, that's how we did handle it.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Actually curious, Peter, did you get any, like, did the bishop's office or anybody, comment on it? Have there been pushback from them about how you've reported on it, et cetera?
No, I mean, we went to them and they've, you know, we're sympathetic, well, no, empathetic to him as well, because he's saying, look, I got this massive debt that I've got to pay. What am I going to do? Make it out of fish? You know, like I mean, he's not actually saying that, but that's essentially what he's saying. I've got to get money. What am I going to do? You know, and it's within my purview, and there's a whole debate about whether in fact it is or isn't, to sell off these properties. And you tell me what else I should do. You know, and they can, you know, I understand their, you know, their grandfathers and their great grandfathers and everything were, you know, born and baptized and died in funerals and all the rest of it in these churches and in that particular church. What am I supposed to do? I've got to pay this debt. So, you know, I mean, I think as long as you present that, which we have, present that side fairly, you know, it's a news story like any other. You just have to make sure that you're fair.
How do you convince? There have been some, I'm not the editor, so it's not really my fight to have, but I'm just curious. There are a couple of stories that came up. One had to do with the moving of a Spanish language mass, where parishioners were upset they were going to have to go to a different church for their Spanish language mass, and it's my understanding that the bishop's office didn't want the story told, and how do you maybe convince them of the importance of sharing that story, or that the people of the diocese also need their viewpoint heard? What is the balance there?
I mean, I think one of the first things you have to do is, like, even though you're kind of naturally be drawn to the folks who have the grievance, you have to recognize that they're people with a grievance. Right. And so once they've got your ear, they're gonna more than fill it. And they might not always fill it with exactly factual stuff. And they might fluff it up a bit because they've got a cause. And I think the first step you have to take is to say, okay, wait, I'm not the arbiter here. I'm not the referee. I don't have a whistle or a striped shirt. So I got to be careful how much I listen to these folks versus what what the bishop says. And I think you go to the if you need to, you go to the diocesan or archdiocesan office and you just say, look, this is a matter of public interest. These people are going to talk anyway. We can handle it in a way that's fair, that's balanced, that reflects what you have to say and what they have to say too. But we will keep that an equilibrium between those two things. We are not taking sides in this. And I think, there's a reasonableness test to that. And that's basically all well, it's not all you can do, but I think that's the primary thing to do. But just to check into your own self and say, hey, this is a hot story. I'm just going to load it up with what, Pablo and John and everybody else has to say. No, be careful with that stuff. Does that make sense? I mean,
it does.
Yes.
Yeah, it does. I think exactly what you had said, that it was almost the story's going to be, this was my perspective, the story is going to be told, who do we want telling the story? And we didn't tell the story. The story did go to a public paper. Right. And I felt it was a missed opportunity. Our editor felt that way as well, but then it was a situation where what do you do in the bishop's office saying we're not going to do it, so
I think
go
this
ahead.
is a really important point. For some of us work for Catholic publications that have the bishop as the publisher, and others work for Catholic publications that have a board as the publisher, so they're considered independent Catholic publications. It matters if your publisher is the bishop, right? And you have a different kind of job to do, and sometimes convincing the bishop that that this is a good story to run, because it's better that we tell the story than that someone else tells the story, right? Because we can cover all the angles, we have access to the best information because we're on the inside of the community. And then B, to trust the staff with the story, right? And sometimes there are bishops who don't necessarily understand how journalism can be at the service of the church, which is what I talked about at the beginning in the very first class. And what I talked about in last week as well, how journalism can serve the church. And some bishops have been burned by the media, and they don't even want their own media, right? So there's a trust factor there, and it's a lot of work to nurture your relationship with your bishop. It's a lot of work, and it's something that has to be done, and it impacts the operations of a diocesan newspaper on multiple levels, you know. And sometimes, if they don't understand how journalism works, then sometimes they take the drastic decision of axing your newspaper altogether, right? Because they don't understand. Again, I'm repeating myself, but you get the idea. So. I've worked for independent Catholic newspaper that answered to a board, and we would run stories where there was conflict with the Archbishop, and everyone was given an opportunity to say their part, you know. So the Archbishop would have his opportunity to give his side of the story. The blessing there is that this particular Archbishop, this is in Montreal, the late Cardinal Turcotte, really understood the media and really liked the media and understood what we were trying to do and how we could help serve the story, serve the church by telling the story plainly and telling it before the secular press got to it, right? Because he could trust us with us. He learned that he could trust us with it. And so we had a very good relationship with the Archbishop. Then I worked for a publication where the bishop was the publisher. And this is where I had to do the work of, let us tell the story first. Let's not make the Chicago Tribune tell the story, right? And come knocking at your door and you don't answer. And then they have to have this nasty line of, there was no answer at the Chancery office and the bishop declined to comment, and all this kind of negative stuff that's terrible for public opinion when it, you know, public opinion as regards the church. And that was a lot of work. You know, that was a lot of work, and didn't always win that battle, because at the end of the day, the publisher is the boss, right? And so then you're walking this really, really difficult line, right? Because you have a readership. I mean, you're serving the bishop, but you're also serving your readership. And there are people who really want to know. They want their newspaper to reflect to them what's happening in the community. That's their source of information. And so how do you walk that line? How can you serve both constituencies, your boss and your readership, right? And so sometimes you have to compromise. And you have to sometimes go back to the bishop, you know, like there's a missed opportunity, and then there's a development in the story, and go back to the bishop and say, you know, can we do it now? Can we do it again? How about if we did this instead? Right? And sometimes you're not necessarily with the bishop, sometimes you're negotiating with the vicar general, or depending how big your diocese is, you know. But that dance, every Catholic editor I know has to do that dance at one point or another, you know.
I think it's a good segue though, because I think you'll see in Paul's the class on the social teaching of the church vis-a-vis communications and media, that there's actually answers to that very conundrum and that very question, in that the church herself teaches within you know, a right context the value of exactly what Laura's describing, that that both that dynamic, but also the need to tell the truth, and to tell the truth through media. That the church is not, through her teaching, and this is Paul's baby, not mine, but the church is not hostile to the media. Through her social teaching, no, she values it. And you know, if you have to fall back on quoting chapter and verse, well, you know.
You know,
Yeah, one of the things I'll bring up is that in my session is that the church teaches that the faithful have a right to certain information, and the media, the Catholic media especially, have a right, a duty to report it. The one thing I would caution, however, is that not every story is a story. And Peter knows, and Laura, you can go into any parish and find disgruntled people. You can
Oh,
go
yeah.
into any Catholic school and find disgruntled people. And
Absolutely.
not everybody who's disgruntled has a story to tell. So you're usually looking for something, some aspect that will say, this makes it special. There's some unfairness going on or some wrongness or some aspect of grace that can be conveyed in the story, and then you can sell your bishop on it.
Yeah.
Be prepared to get the door slammed.
So
'Cause you
all of
might
these
say no.
examples, these scenarios that I gave are all things that I've had to deal with myself, and so I'm
Yep.
putting them out there. And this whole the church sale thing, I will say that when I was working for a publication where there was the bishop was the publisher, and there was this really important property that was going up for sale, and the information was not available. The sale price was not on MLS. They were looking for private investors. They were looking for a buyer quietly. Okay, so the sale price was not divulged, and so here the bishop didn't want to divulge that, right? Okay, so then how can I be responsible both to the bishop and to the readership? Well, what I did was I went into what was publicly available, like Peter said, and what was out there. I went to the county records. I went to the county records. It wasn't on MLS or anything like that, right? So, okay, how is this property divided? Well, I had seen that there was something that had been done like a few weeks earlier that divided that property instead of one lot into two lots, the rectory and the church. So there's going to be two sales. They're going to sell them separately. So I was able to communicate that this property was divided into two lots, right? So that why? Because our churches are funded by generations of believers who have been generous with their donations and their money, you know? And so it's respecting that, right? To say, well, we honor your sacrifice and your commitment to the church. And this is what's happening with the property that you've been supporting for 80 years. This is how it's going to be divided according to these county records, right? So the bishop isn't implicated, and ask me, where'd you get this information? Well, it's there, right? It's publicly available. And it's, for all intents and purposes, rather neutral, right? But at least we're honoring the reader. We're not keeping them totally in the dark, And that's part of sometimes the discussions we have to have with our bishops and say, we need to inform our readers. We have to treat them like, this is my line, that we have to, like adult Christians, right? We got to talk turkey with them. Like, we're doing this because we need money. It's okay. It's okay. They're adults. They can take it, like they have homes, they run their own finances, and we can talk finances with them because, they're dealing with it themselves, and we can be plain about these things too, and treat them like adults. Do you know what I'm saying? So
And
anyway,
if you've got a reasonable bishop,
yeah,
we've all had occasions where we've been able to sway them,
yeah,
either not for the full story, but at least tell
yeah.
some story. And other times they say no. But that happens at secular papers too. I've had
Sure.
publishers shut the door on stories they didn't want in the paper. It happens.
Yeah.
And to go back to, well, what both Laura and Paul are saying. I mean, in the process of gathering and assessing a story, one of the things that you do almost, automatically, or if not unconsciously, is assess, okay, is this really critical to the story? And if someone comes, in a, whether it's the bishop or in a position where they're involved, and they go, look, if you report